Jarrett, Chapter 11, the Great Depression and the New Deal. The Great Depression, we look upon it as being essentially the 1930s. You could argue the Great Depression began, or at least the beginnings of the Great Depression started in 1929 with the stock market collapsing. And of course, the Great Depression does not end until we get into World War I, which was 1941. Now, no, those dates are not the exact beginning and end. A lot of people associate those dates. You could argue that the Great Depression really started about 1932. And I think most historians would use that date. And it really didn't end until about 1942. And so either way you look at it, either using these dates here at the bottom or these dates here across the top, we're looking at more than a decade or more of a depression. And during that Great Depression is when we had the New Deal. The New Deal was the policies, the domestic policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. And so we're going to go into all this material during this video. All right, let us begin. And by going, hold on.
Can you come to the front office?
All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. I am recording this on our work day on January the 18th. And so if I'm interrupted by the announcements from time to time, I'll just stop it and we'll keep going afterward. All right. Let's take a look at these terms. There are, I believe, 44 terms in this chapter. I'm going to try to keep these videos about 20 or so minutes. And so if it takes 2 or 3 of them, that's fine. It's not a problem. Anyway, let us begin and look at the first 6 here on this one, the Great Depression. And the Great Depression is the worst economic period of time in American history. This is what we call the Depression that started in the late 20s, early 30s, and went all the way through to the beginning of World War II. That's what we call it. What is a depression? Well, a depression is an economic period. Now, again, this period could be months, it can be years, it could be like ours, more than a decade. But it was characterized by business failures, high unemployment, falling prices. So, business failures. Business can no longer keep their doors open because of a number of issues. And we're going to talk about this as we go, what exactly caused the stock market crash, which led to this. In fact, let's do number 6 real quickly. Stock market crash. It was in October 29th, 1929, set off a chain reaction. Investors lost savings. Companies could not sell stocks to raise money. Manufacturers closed factories. Prices dropped. Unemployment grew. So what happened to us, and let's erase all this and move on because I want to make sure you can see this and understand this. So the stock market crash, which was October of 29, there was a chain reaction to events. People had been investing in the stock market. They lost their savings. Now, how did they invest? Most of them, let's go to number 3, bought a margin. Stocks could be purchased by putting down a 10% payment. Let's say you want to buy 10,000 shares of stock. Well, you don't have to put up all 10,000. You can put up 10%, 1,000, and the rest would be paid at a later date, or even worse probably is you would borrow the other 90%, the other 9,000 from a bank. Either way is bad. So you're buying stocks on margin. You're putting a small down payment, 10%. The rest will be paid at a later date, or you borrowed the money from a bank. And the idea was you buy $10,000 worth of stock. You put up 10%, $1,000. In 6 months, a year, you sell the stock for $25,000. Keep in mind, you invested 10, you sell for $25,000. That's $15,000. You pay back the loan from the bank with interest. The rest is profit. You didn't take it and go back and invest more. Instead of buying the second time around $10,000, you buy $50,000. And so what do you have to do? Well, again, you have to buy on margin. So our investors, people who were buying on margin, lost everything, which means that they, hold on.
How's it going, man?
All right, I'm back. I was gone for a few minutes talking to one of the teachers. And let's get back to this. So investors lost their savings. Again, they were putting 10% down. The rest would be paid at a later date. Or, of course, they borrowed the money. Either way, they're in deep trouble. So when the stock market collapsed, all that money that was invested by you, again, you only maybe put up $1,000 to the $10,000, but you owe the other $9,000. And so since you couldn't pay that off, well, the banks would then repossess your furniture, your car, your clothing, your jewelry, whatever the case may be. Okay. Our second item down here, companies could not sell stock to raise money. Well, again, why? Well, because no one had any money. Even though you may not have invested in the stock market, your boss did. And when your boss could not afford to pay you or could not afford to pay you all those hours, he either cut your hours down or fired you. Or you may not invest in the stock market, but you own a small business and most of your customers invest in the stock market. They no longer have any cash to go to your business. So what are you going to do? Well, you're not selling anything. Let's say you have a small restaurant and no one's coming to eat at your restaurant because, again, they don't have any cash. So you can't keep your full staff employed. So you either have to cut back on hours or fire them. So because companies could not sell stock to raise money, they had to let workers go. Workers are not working. That means they're not buying anything, which means other companies will also lose money and have to cut back on the hours of the employees. Let's go to our third one here. Manufacturers close their factories. So again, if no one's buying anything, and again, all this spirals from the stock market collapsing. It's like throwing a pebble in a calm body of water. That pebble is the stock market crashing. All the ripples outward are the events that take place as a result of that initial pebble, the stock market crashing. And we talked about in chapter 10 how and why that it led up to that. And we'll go into a little bit more depth as well in this chapter. So it is a chain reaction. Again, the stock market collapsing was a chain reaction. We got investors losing their savings. Companies cannot sell stocks to raise money. Manufacturers are closing their factories because no one's buying anything. So now all those workers are being either let go or having their hours cut dramatically. As a result of this, prices were dropping. Prices are falling. Again, there's somewhat of a surplus. Okay, and again, we've talked about supply and demand. When there is a surplus, when there is overproduction, prices fall. Now, again, for the consumer, that's usually a good thing. I can go buy more now because prices are falling. But the problem is, because of all of this stuff we're talking about, because of the stock market crashing and that chain reaction we've been talking about, no one has any money. And what is the last thing? Well, unemployment grew. Again, we go back to what we talked about. Unemployment is growing. Why? Stock market has collapsed. People who were buying on margin, putting down just 10% and paid off the rest later or borrowed the rest from a bank, they lost everything. And we're talking a good percentage of Americans. I don't think I've ever seen a percentage given how many Americans had invested in the stock market, but it was a good percentage, a very high percentage. And a lot of that was people who were employers, the rich, the well-to-do, the upper middle class and richer. They're the ones who create jobs. Small entrepreneurs, small business owners, restaurant owners, factory owners, they were trying to make a little bit more money by investing in the market. And when the stock market collapsed, they lost everything. And since they lost everything, and again, we go back to all of this down here, okay, when investors lost their savings, they could not go out and buy anything. Companies started having to let people go because they couldn't sell enough stock to raise money, keep them going, because no one had any extra cash. Manufacturers were closing their factories because, again, no one was buying their stuff. They had to let people go. Prices were falling, which is usually great for consumers, but again, no one had any money to buy anything, and as a result of all those things, unemployment grew. Okay? Let's go to the other two that we skipped and talk about them. Interest, money collected above the amount borrowed when it's paid back. Now again, money collected above. This is the key word, above the amount that is borrowed. When you borrow the money, you are expected to pay it back with interest. So let's say you borrowed $9,000. Go back to our scenario that we were discussing a little bit earlier. Let's clean this up right here a little bit. Okay. So let's go back to our scenario. You're going to buy on margin. You put 10% down. You borrow the other 9. You don't pay back just 9. You pay back 9 plus interest. Now, again, what was the interest rate? Well, it varied. So you borrow 9, you may have to pay back 10. But you do pay back above the amount you borrowed. That's interest. Black Tuesday. This is the term we use to refer to October 29th. Again, talked about it already. October 29th, this is when the stock market collapsed. The stock market prices kept falling as a result of a panic, which caused prices to fall even more. Supply and demand. When there is a huge supply, prices fall. And what happened was, as the stock market opened on October 29th, people started dumping their stocks. There had been some concern about the stock market for some time, and this was the day. Now, why was this day? I have no idea. But this was the day. People started trying to sell their stocks. As they dumped more stocks on the market, other people saw that. They panicked. They tried to sell their stock, so more stocks were dumped on the market. And as the supply of stocks kept growing, prices started to fall. People saw prices falling. They got scared. They dumped their stocks in the market, which created even a larger supply of stock, and the prices fell more. More people try to sell their stock, and it just snowballs. Okay, let us move to the next page, the next slide. And we're looking at 7 through 11. The Federal Reserve Board, okay, a government entity whose job was to oversee the economy by controlling the interest rate. Now, the Reserve Board, which, by the way, is still around to this day, it is created by the government. It is to oversee the economy by a number of reasons, a number of ways, and one of them was to control the interest rates. Interest rates are what we pay above and beyond a bank loan. It could be on a bank loan, it can be on a credit card, it could be a loan for a house, a car, it doesn't really matter. So when you borrow money from an entity like a bank, you pay them back with interest. That interest is determined by the Federal Reserve Board. The interest is determined by the Federal Reserve Board, and you can make money cheaper by lowering the interest rate. That means it's easier to borrow money. It's easier to pay it back, so money's cheaper to borrow. You can make money more expensive to borrow by raising the interest rate. And it is an ongoing struggle by the federal government, the Federal Reserve Board, to control the interest rates so that way there is either enough money to borrow or not enough. It depends on what they want to do. If they want money cheaper, they lower interest rates. If they want money more expensive, they raise interest rates. It is often something that is done poorly by the federal government, but that's the way the system works. Number 8, Herbert Hoover. And this, of course, is the Republican president, first elected in 1828. The stock market crashed during his term. The crash led to the Great Depression. It really helped. It did not exactly itself lead to the Great Depression, but it was one of a number of events that led to the Great Depression. We all too often make it so simple that the stock market crashing caused the Great Depression, and that's not really true. It was a huge factor, but it wasn't the only factor. Now, Hoover did very little to help the American people during his tenure in office. Again, the stock market collapsed in October of 29. He was elected in November of 28. He'd only been in office about 8-9 months when the stock market collapsed. He really had nothing to do with that. His party did. The Republican Party policies of laissez-faire economics. The Republican Party policies of laissez-faire economics, his own personal belief, Hoover's own personal belief in rugged individualism, a term we had a few chapters ago, led him to believe that the people would correct the problems of the stock market collapsing. by the time he got around to doing something to help the American public in late 31, early 32, it was too late. Most Americans blamed him for the stock market collapse and the Great Depression, which in actuality is not really fair. Should he have done something sooner to help the American public? Yes, he should have. But then, again, that went against his political belief system. What little he did was working, but he never got a chance to follow it up. He never got a second term. Why? Well, because in 1932, again, Hoover was a one-term president. He lost the 32 election to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. FDR won in a landslide over Hoover. Why? Because, again, Hoover was thought to be uncaring, insensitive to the needs of the American public. Not that he was. He was a good man. He actually was probably the best of the three Republican presidents in the decade. But again, his belief in rugged individualism meant that he could not act to help the American public because, again, he believed it was the American public's duty to do it on their own, and he believed the American public could do it on their own. Anyway, FDR defeats him pretty easily in 32, and FDR did serve as president during the Great Depression. And to be perfectly honest, a number of his policies helped contribute to the Great Depression. You could even argue that his policies made the Great Depression worse, and we're going to discuss that later on. Number 10, John Steinbeck, writer who recorded the suffering during the Great Depression. He wrote a book, The Grapes of Wrath, about the Okies, people from Oklahoma, who moved to California as migrant farm workers. So Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, recorded some of the suffering of the Great Depression during the Dust Bowl. We'll talk about the Dust Bowl a little bit later on. His book centered around Okies, people from Oklahoma, who began to migrate to California looking for jobs in the fields, primarily picking grapes. Dorothea Lange, a photographer who recorded a great deal of suffering of the Great Depression. And we will see some of her work in a PowerPoint I have, if we haven't already seen it. All right, let's move on to the next slide, which will be numbers 12 through 17. Our first one is the Mexican Repatriation Act. Required Mexican immigrants. Now, again, I think this is the important part of it. Mexican immigrants, not people of Mexican descent who were in America, who were U.S. citizens, but Mexican immigrants to be returned to Mexico, and sometimes they were forcibly removed. Now, keep in mind, we're in the Great Depression. Jobs are somewhat scarce. And so in order to create more opportunities for American citizens, the Mexican Repatriation Act was passed. It required Mexican immigrants, again, not U.S. citizens of Mexican descent, but Mexican immigrants, to be returned to Mexico, sometimes by force. The Dust Bowl. I told you we get to this. This was years of drought, not a lot of rainfall, dried up the vegetation and topsoil of the Great Plains. The Great Plains, essentially the area between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. So because of overworking the land, planting the same crop year after year after year, because of drought, the Great Plains don't get a lot of rain to begin with, but because of prolonged drought, because of poor usage of the land, using of the land, the vegetation and topsoil dried up, which led to then heavy winds, which lasted a decade. I mean, not continuous, but there was a period of time in the 30s where there were a large number of these windstorms. And again, normally wouldn't be a problem because the topsoil would be in place, held in place by vegetation, by the grass, by the crops, but because of overuse, because of drought, the vegetation and topsoil was dried up, so the wind was able to pick up the dirt and blew it hundreds of miles, often burying homes and destroying other harvests, other crops. So as the topsoil was carried away by these heavy winds, in some cases, entire cities were almost wiped off the face of the earth. In some cases, fields hundreds of miles away were wiped out by all this dust, all this dirt blowing during the Dust Bowl. It was during the Dust Bowl when the Okies from Oklahoma, who were depicted in Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath, who lost everything in Oklahoma, packed up and moved to California looking for jobs in the fields, particularly picking grapes. All right, the New Deal. This was FDR's plan to put America back to work. This is his domestic policy, which he refers to as the New Deal. It is sort of a takeoff on the Square Deal, which was the name given to Teddy Roosevelt's domestic policy. Teddy and FDR are distant cousins. And so as a way to either rip off Teddy, and Teddy was a very popular, fairly effective president, or because of a way to pay tribute to Teddy, I'm not really sure which, the term the New Deal was used by FDR. And again, this was his domestic agenda to put Americans back to work. 3 more and we'll finish up this video. Hoovervilles. These were shanty towns, and a shanty town is an impromptu, poorly put together tent city or homes being put together, constructed with castaway timber or even in some cases cardboard boxes. And so these shanty towns were made up of the unemployed and the homeless. And these Hoovervilles, these shanty towns, sprang up all around the nation, in particular, particularly near large cities. And so they were called Hoovervilles as a way to insult Herbert Hoover, whom most America believed was responsible for the Great Depression. Now, again, that is not true. It's not really his fault. Could he have done more after the Great Depression? After the stock market collapsed? Yes. Should he have done more? Definitely. But was the stock market collapsing his fault? No. So these Hoovervilles were these little communities, little towns, tent cities, homes being built out of castaway lumber or metal or even cardboard boxes. The unemployed and the homeless lived in these, and these popped up all over the nation, again, particularly around big cities. Fireside Chats, number 16. These were a series of radio broadcasts made by FDR to explain his policies of how he plans to end the Great Depression. Fireside Chats, a series of radio broadcasts by FDR to explain his policies to the American public. And he is the first to use this medium, radio, to convey his plans for the American public. There are any number of these that you can find online if you want to hear them. Time permits, we may play a little bit of one of them. But Roosevelt did a real good job. I will give him credit, though I don't think he is as great a president as many people believe. He did do a great job of keeping the morale of the American public up during this extremely dark period of time in American history. For that, he does deserve credit. He was extremely optimistic, very visible. Let's include his wife in this right now, number 17, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was FDR's wife. She served as his eyes and ears by traveling throughout the nation for him. Now, keep in mind, as we have seen or we will see, FDR was struck by polio a few years prior to becoming president. He was essentially unable to walk or stand on his own without the use of some type of device, either braces on his knees or a walker, cane, whatever the case may be. And so, since he could not get out of the White House and travel as much as he would like, he sent his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and she would tour the country, talking to people, and help convey what they thought, what they wanted, what their hopes and dreams were, what they needed to FDR. And in exchange, she would then relay to the people what FDR was trying to do. So in addition to these fireside chats that Roosevelt used quite effectively, by sending his wife out, and she is often thought to be, and most commonly thought to be, the best first lady ever. Again, I'm not going to argue that. I think she was a pretty good first lady. Again, she served this role as being the eyes and ears for FDR quite well. She was very popular. Anyway, through these two efforts, through fireside chats and using his wife as sort of a spokesperson, FDR was able to keep the spirits of the American public pretty high. He was able, through his boundless enthusiasm, to buoy the American public spirits, their feelings. I mean, with things like the phrase, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That type of rhetoric was able to keep the American public going. And again, for that, I will give him credit. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end this one for right now. We will come back and we will get to the rest of the vocabulary terms from Chapter 11 in the next video. Bye.